The wind, a ceaseless sculptor of sand and rock, sang its ancient song through the high desert. I, Dean Marcus, had long ceased to hear it as mere sound. It was the breath of the world, a constant companion in my self-imposed solitude. My observatory, a gleaming sentinel of white and chrome, perched precariously on a plateau overlooking a panorama of rust-red earth and distant, jagged peaks. It was here, amidst this vast, indifferent beauty, that I sought the whispers of forgotten eras, the celestial alignments that once guided the hands of builders long turned to dust. My days were a rhythmic dance between the silent hum of my instruments and the profound quiet of my own thoughts. Dawn brought the cool, crisp air, sharp with the scent of creosote and dust. Dusk painted the sky in impossible gradients of violet and gold, a fleeting spectacle I often watched from the main dome, a silent observer in a world that felt increasingly distant. Human connection had thinned to spectral threads over the years, replaced by the grand, silent narratives of the cosmos and the intricate patterns of ancient stones. My work was my anchor, my obsession, my only true companion. This morning, however, the familiar rhythm felt subtly off-kilter. A restless energy thrummed beneath my skin, a premonition I couldn't quite place. I had spent the past weeks poring over archaeological scans, data beamed to me from a recent excavation. A team of field researchers, a collection of sun-baked, earnest faces I barely remembered, had uncovered something extraordinary in a remote valley, beyond the furthest reach of the mountain pass that marked my own journey into isolation. They'd found a subterranean structure, not unlike the early ceremonial sites I dedicated my life to studying, but with an unsettling purity of form, an alien precision that defied any known ancient civilization. My role was to analyze its astronomical orientation, to find the stars it once mirrored, the deities it might have honored. I sat before my main console, the soft glow of myriad screens illuminating the tired lines etched around my eyes. The coffee, bitter and black, did little to sharpen my focus. Instead, a peculiar lethargy seemed to cling to me, a weight in the air. I had cross-referenced the structure's ingress points with hundreds of stellar maps, ancient and modern. Nothing. No known constellation, no significant planetary conjunction, no lunar cycle aligned with its perfectly chiseled portals. It was an anomaly, a geometric riddle whispering of a sky that had never existed, or perhaps, a sky seen through eyes that were not human. My fingers, calloused from years of fine-tuning equipment and tracing ancient glyphs, hovered over the holographic projection of the structure. It was a marvel of impossible angles, its inner chambers spiraling into a central core. The field researchers' initial reports had noted an unusual energy signature emanating from the core, too faint and intermittent to categorize. They dismissed it as geological interference, a quirk of the desert's deep strata. But my array of sensors, far more sensitive, had been continuously monitoring it. For days, the data stream had been flat, unremarkable. Then, a flicker. A subtle ripple on the spectral analyzer, a deviation in the baseline noise that was barely perceptible. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, my gaze fixed on the anomaly. It wasn't a spike, not a burst of energy. It was more like a sustained hum, a frequency that didn't register on any known electromagnetic spectrum. It was too low, too steady, too wrong. I ran a diagnostic on the sensors, suspecting a malfunction. All systems green. I isolated the signal, filtering out terrestrial interference, solar flares, cosmic background radiation. What remained was a pure, unadulterated tone, emanating directly from the subterranean core. It wasn't a radio wave, it didn't propagate like light. It was something else entirely, an impossible resonance that bypassed conventional physics. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and empirical data, began to fray at the edges. This wasn't a signal in the way I understood signals. It was more akin to a presence, a sustained thought vibrating through the very fabric of existence. The air in the dome seemed to thicken, pressing in on me, though the atmospheric readings were perfectly normal. I brought up the raw data, a torrent of numbers and graphs scrolling across my main screen. The signal's waveform was unnervingly complex, a fractal geometry that repeated infinitely, yet never truly repeated. It was a pattern of absolute order, yet utterly chaotic in its detail. My archaeoastronomy had taught me to find patterns in the chaos of the stars, to see the grand designs in the seemingly random. But this was a design beyond comprehension. A knot tightened in my stomach. The field researchers, in their eagerness, had merely catalogued the structure. They had not truly listened to it. I was listening now, and what I heard was not a message, but an invitation. An invitation to something ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent to the fragile scaffolding of human understanding. The impossible signal pulsed, a silent, persistent thrum against the walls of my mind. It was calling, and I, alone in the vast desert, was the only one to hear its terrible, beautiful song. The sun, a merciless orb, had begun its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and bleeding orange. Today, however, its grandeur felt diminished, a mere backdrop to the persistent hum of my ground-penetrating radar unit. I steered the all-terrain vehicle, its tires churning through the fine, crimson dust, along the perimeter of what was once a ceremonial alignment, a forgotten people's testament to the cosmic ballet above. My current survey route hugged the base of a jagged mountain pass, its ancient stones carved by millennia of wind, whispering tales only the sand could truly hear. My eyes, accustomed to the stark contrasts of the desert, scanned the GPR display, a small, vibrant rectangle of light against the encroaching twilight. For hours, it had shown the predictable subterranean tapestry, layers of sandstone, ancient alluvial deposits, pockets of limestone. The geological autobiography of this place, legible to me as my own reflection. The air was still, save for the distant shriek of a hawk, a sound swallowed quickly by the vastness. I felt the familiar rhythm of my work, a meditative dance between man, machine, and earth. Then, a flicker. A disturbance. I blinked, recalibrating my gaze. It was subtle at first, a faint ripple in the uniform strata, a ghost in the machine's meticulous rendering. I slowed the vehicle, my grip tightening on the wheel. This wasn't a known fault line, nor was it consistent with any archaeological remains I had ever catalogued. It was too deep, too broad. I rerouted, tracing a wider arc, pulling the GPR unit, a sled of sensors and antennae, behind me. The anomaly persisted, growing clearer with each pass. It wasn't a ripple, it was an echo, impossibly vast. The screen resolved the disturbance into a coherent, albeit confounding, shape. Below the familiar bedrock, at a depth that defied typical human construction or natural formation, lay something immense. The display, usually a gradient of blues and greens representing density, now showed a solid, stark crimson mass, an unnatural intrusion at almost 300 meters down. Its edges were too sharp, its form too geometric, yet too sprawling to be anything I could readily identify. I stopped the vehicle, the engine cutting out, leaving me in the sudden, profound quiet of the desert. The only sound was the gentle whir of the GPR unit, still dutifully scanning, still confirming the impossible. I climbed out, my boots crunching on the gravel, and walked around to the back of the vehicle, leaning over the screen. My fingers, usually steady, trembled slightly as I zoomed in, then out, trying to make sense of the data. This wasn't a cavern. It wasn't a mineral deposit. The internal structure, as hinted by the radar's deepest penetration, suggested a complex lattice, a vast, interwoven architecture that seemed to absorb the waves rather than merely reflect them. A thrill, sharp and exhilarating, shot through me. This was it. The kind of discovery that reshaped history, that rewrote textbooks. My mind raced, cataloging possibilities, dismissing them as quickly as they arose. No known civilization possessed the technology to build something so deep, so vast, so incredibly ancient. The readings suggested an age far predating any human presence in this region, perhaps even predating the earliest hominids. It hummed with a silent antiquity that made the millennia-old alignments I studied seem like recent graffiti. The sheer scale of it, the impossible depth, the unnatural regularity of its internal echoes, it spoke of a builder, yes, but not one of flesh and blood, not one bound by the physics I understood. It was an anomaly that screamed of a truth beyond terrestrial confines, a truth that had slumbered beneath the sand for untold eons. My scientific determination, usually a steadfast beacon, flickered under the weight of this revelation. The structure wasn't merely ancient, it was other. The implications began to ripple through my thoughts, disturbing the placid surface of my understanding. What kind of intelligence could construct such a thing? What purpose could it serve, buried so deep, so completely hidden from the sun and stars it seemed to mock? I stood there, the GPR screen glowing faintly in the deepening gloom, its crimson blotch a stark, terrifying promise. I had found something. But what, precisely, had I awakened? The sun, a bruised fruit, finally bled into the horizon, leaving behind a sky of deepening indigo. The air, crisp with the desert's nightly breath, offered no solace. My thoughts were a churning eddy, fixated on the jagged maw that had opened in the earth, the subterranean structure I'd unearthed. Sleep was a forgotten concept, irrelevant in the face of such impossible geometry. I had returned to my primary observation station, a collection of robust, field-tested instruments housed in a reinforced trailer, nestled precariously on a ledge overlooking a winding mountain pass. The stark cliffs, ancient sentinels, seemed to lean in, their craggy faces etched with eons of wind and sand. Below, the pass snaked like a petrified serpent, a path I had traversed countless times, but which now felt imbued with an alien gravity. Inside the trailer, the low hum of electronics was a familiar lullaby, now discordant. My hands, calloused from years of handling rock samples and delicate optics, moved with a frantic precision. I deployed the ground-penetrating radar, its antenna a metallic spider on the trailer's roof, its tendrils reaching into the bedrock. I aimed the array directly at the coordinates of the structure, a few kilometers distant, hoping to map its internal architecture, to understand what lay beneath the exposed obsidian-like surface. The screen glowed in sickly green, a pulse of energy sent, a faint echo returned. The initial scans were a jumble of anomalies. No familiar seismic signatures, no telltale sedimentary layers, no igneous intrusions. The structure was an imposter, a void in the geological record, yet undeniably there. Its density readings were off the charts, its composition resisting conventional classification. It was as if the very rock refused to be known. Frustration gnawed at me, a sharp-edged thing. I needed something more. With a sigh that felt torn from my very core, I switched to the specialized electromagnetic spectrum analyzer, a finicky piece of equipment I usually reserved for detecting faint cosmic background radiation anomalies, echoes of the universe's nascent moments. It was an extreme measure, a shot in the dark, but the impossible nature of the structure demanded impossible methods. I connected the sensor array, a delicate web of interwoven wires and microantennas, positioning it to focus on the subterranean anomaly. My eyes, gritty from lack of rest, scanned the fluctuating graphs, the frequency readouts. Nothing. Just the endless, empty hum of the cosmos, devoid of anything new. Then, a flicker. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was faint, barely above the noise floor, but it was there. Not random, not static. It possessed a subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm, like a heart beating in the deep earth, or a forgotten clock chiming in a sealed vault. I adjusted the filters, amplifying the signal, stripping away the cosmic chatter. The ripple gained substance, resolving into a distinct pattern. It wasn't a single pulse, but a complex sequence of energy fluctuations, a harmonic progression utterly unlike any natural terrestrial or astrophysical phenomenon I had ever encountered. It was ordered, intricate, a tapestry woven from pure electromagnetic force. My mind raced, scrambling for a comparison. Tectonic stress? Geomagnetic anomaly? Subsurface water flow? No. This signal was deliberate. It possessed an internal logic, a terrifyingly consistent structure that hinted at intelligence, yet defied any language, any code, any form of communication I knew. It wasn't Morse, wasn't binary, wasn't a radio wave modulated with human speech. It was something else entirely. I tried to visualize it, to translate the EM fluctuations into an audible frequency, a desperate attempt to find familiarity. A low, resonant hum filled the trailer, a sound that vibrated not just in my ears, but in my bones. It was a tonal progression, a sequence of shifting pitches and durations that formed a melody, a silent hymn played on instruments beyond human craft. The rhythm pulsed, steady and unyielding, yet its complexity was overwhelming. It shifted, layered upon itself, creating harmonies that grated against my understanding of music, of sound, of reality itself. It was a language without words, a meaning without context. My mind, trained for years to decipher the universe's hidden messages in light and stone, found only a gaping chasm here. This wasn't just a signal, it was an utterance. And it wasn't meant for human ears, or human minds. It was a communication from something utterly alien, something that existed on a different plane of being, its very presence manifesting as these incomprehensible electromagnetic waves. The structure beneath the desert, the impossible geometry, the silent hymn, they were all facets of a single, terrifying truth. And it was speaking directly into the heart of my solitude. The tension in the small trailer became a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. I was no longer merely an observer, I was a recipient. And the message had only just begun. The desert night, a vast, cold canvas, swallowed the last sliver of twilight. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of dry earth and distant sage, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with the hum of electronics and the relentless, alien pulse of the signal. Sleep had become a luxury I could not afford, a weakness I refused to indulge. The impossible transmission, plucked from the newly revealed subterranean structure, was a puzzle demanding every fragment of my will. I leaned closer to the console, my eyes tracing the jagged peaks and valleys of the waveform on the main monitor. Hours blurred into an unbroken continuum of analysis. My fingers danced across the holographic interface, sifting through spectral data, running algorithms designed to find patterns in the chaos. The signal defied every known law of physics, every established communication protocol. It was a language without a lexicon, a melody without a scale. Yet, I was determined to force it into human understanding. A sudden, jarring flicker in my peripheral vision made me flinch. The monitor seemed to ripple, its crisp lines momentarily blurring as if submerged in water. I blinked hard, rubbing the grit from my eyes. Fatigue, I told myself. A trick of the light, the strain of endless hours staring at screens. But the sensation lingered, a phantom echo behind my eyelids, a subtle misalignment of the world. I pushed it away, focusing back on the data, the relentless pursuit of meaning. The signal's core frequency, a low thrum that vibrated through the very floor, seemed to have a gravitational pull. I had isolated segments, magnified their intricacies, and found nothing that resembled natural phenomena or human artifice. It was pure, unadulterated otherness. As I cycled through a particularly dense sequence, a faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the ambient static of the older, analog receiver I kept running for comparison. A whisper, like dry leaves skittering across stone, seemed to weave itself into the white noise. It was gone as quickly as it came, a ghost in the machine. I frowned, tapping the side of the receiver. Faulty wiring, perhaps. The desert dust, always infiltrating, always disrupting. My isolation, I knew, was also playing its part, making me hyper-aware of every minute sound. My dreams were not the restorative balm I craved, but a descent into a landscape of impossible geometry. I walked through structures of non-Euclidean angles, where walls met at obtuse intersections that defied perspective, where corridors twisted into themselves without beginning or end. There was a profound, suffocating sense of scale, of being a minuscule speck in a universe that did not care for my existence, a universe defined by these unearthly forms. A low, resonant hum, eerily similar to the signal, permeated the dreamscape, echoing within my very bones. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from a profound disorientation. The stark lines of my Spartan room seemed too sharp, too real, almost painfully so, after the fluid, shifting reality of the dream. I sat up, clutching my head, trying to shake off the lingering phantoms. It was the lack of sleep, the relentless pressure, the sheer cognitive load of trying to unravel something so fundamentally alien. On the main display, a newly highlighted section of the signal displayed a complex, fractal-like pattern. It wasn't an exact match, but the underlying principles, the strange symmetries, the impossible recursion, were disturbingly similar to the geometries that had populated my dream. It was as if the signal had seeped into my subconscious, guiding my very thoughts, shaping my nightmares. I leaned in, straining to catch a single discernible word, but they remained elusive, formless sonic ghosts. I needed to understand this. I had to. But the cost, I was beginning to suspect, might be more than just my waking hours. Thick with the unspoken, with the hum of the signal. It wasn't merely sound, it was a presence, a weight in the very air, vibrating through the steel and glass of my sanctuary. I had spent days now, lost in its cadence, meticulously charting its impossible origin point beneath the desert floor. It began subtly, an insidious whisper against the edges of my vision. A monitor screen, usually a crisp, cool blue, seemed to shimmer with an undertone of sickly green. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, convinced it was the strain of staring at data for too long. The color corrected itself, or so I thought, receding back to its familiar hue. Fatigue, a cruel mistress, was playing games with my perception. Hours later, hunched over a printout of spectral analysis, I saw it again. A shadow, cast by my own hand, seemed to deepen, to crawl across the paper, independent of the room's fixed light source. It stretched, a liquid stain, then snapped back, leaving my heart thrumming a discordant beat against my ribs. I snatched my hand away, my breath catching. Nothing. Just the paper, stark white under the harsh bulbs. This was more than exhaustion, it was a fraying at the edges of what I knew to be real. Yet, the data on the page screamed for my attention, the anomalous signal a siren song pulling me deeper. My determination, a stubborn anchor, kept me tethered to the task, even as the ground beneath me felt less solid. I needed answers, and this impossible signal promised them, even if the cost was my own steady mind. The incidents grew more frequent, more insistent. The desert outside, viewed through the domes. Viewport, sometimes bled into hues I couldn't name, a fleeting bruise of indigo and rust that vanished when I focused. In my peripheral vision, I caught impossible angles in the rock formations, geometric impossibilities that dissolved into ordinary stone the moment I turned my head. It was like looking at the world through a cracked lens, the fissures appearing and disappearing without warning. Was the signal somehow interfering with my optical nerves? Or was it something far more profound, something rewriting the very rules of light and space within my skull? I had to talk to someone. The isolation of the observatory, once a cherished solitude, now felt like a prison. My thoughts, once clear and sharp, were becoming muddled with these visual aberrations. I thought of the colleague, Dr. Eris Thorne, a fellow archaeoastronomer, though his work was more grounded in traditional celestial mechanics. He was skeptical by nature, rigorous, and perhaps, I hoped, a voice of reason. A sanity check. The drive to the colleague's remote field station was a tortuous journey. The sun beat down, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirage, but the distortions were no longer confined to my peripheral vision. The jagged peaks, usually a comforting sentinel against the sky, now appeared to shift, their ancient rock faces seeming to ripple like disturbed water. The road itself, a ribbon of black against the ochre earth, occasionally buckled and warped ahead of me, only to smooth out an instant before my tires reached the spot. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my jaw clenched. I gripped the wheel, pushing down the rising panic, telling myself it was the heat, the altitude, the lack of sleep. It had to be. Dean, the colleague said, his voice flat, his gaze unwavering over the rim of his steaming mug. His small, cluttered office smelled of old books and stronger coffee. You're describing hallucinations. I leaned forward, the worn armchair creaking beneath me. No, not hallucinations. Not exactly. It's subtle, Eris. Like the world is briefly miscalibrated. And the signal. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not natural. He set his mug down with a soft clink. Dean, you've been out there alone for months. Chasing an anomaly in a newly revealed structure, no less. It's a textbook case of sensory deprivation and overwork. It's projecting." He gestured vaguely at the stacks of papers on his desk. "Your equipment might be faulty, or perhaps the subterranean environment is causing some kind of electromagnetic interference that's affecting your equipment, not the physics of reality. The data is clean, Eris. Impeccable. And it correlates with the visual disturbances. I've cross-referenced, triple-checked. The signal is influencing my perception. It's too precise to be random." I felt a flicker of the impossible geometry in the patterned rug beneath his desk, a sudden, brief warping of the weave, but I forced myself to ignore it, to maintain eye contact. He couldn't see it. He wouldn't believe it. The colleague sighed, a sound of weary patience. "Dean, I understand your excitement. A new discovery, an unknown signal. It's intoxicating. But you're a scientist. You need to step back. Get some rest. Come back to it with a clear head." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Perhaps you should take a break from the observatory altogether." He didn't believe me. He saw a man unraveling, not a man on the precipice of an impossible truth. The world, already subtly askew, tilted further. The skepticism in his eyes was a heavier weight than the signal's hum, cementing my isolation. I was alone in this, watching the fabric of reality fray, and no one else could see the tears. As I stood to leave, the framed diploma on his wall seemed to shimmer, the letters momentarily rearranging themselves into something illegible, something utterly alien, before snapping back into place. He noticed nothing. The skepticism in his eyes was a heavier weight than the signal's hum, cementing the cracks in my world. My colleague's words, a dull echo in the vast silence of the desert night, had left a residue of doubt, not in my discovery, but in my sanity. It was a poison I refused to ingest. I retreated to the observatory, the hum of the equipment a more comforting presence than human reason. The screens glowed, constellations of data points shimmering like distant galaxies. I plunged back into the signal, seeking not just its origin, but its very grammar. My fingers flew across the keyboard, commands unfurling across the interface, isolating sequences, amplifying faint echoes. What I found was not a message, but a blueprint. A self-organizing complexity, intricate beyond any known fractal, yet coherent. It was a pattern that repeated without repetition, a growth without end, an infinite tapestry woven from finite threads. This wasn't a transmission from something, it was a fundamental principle of something. A gnawing hunger, sharp and insistent, pulled me from the console. I stepped outside, the desert air cool against my fevered skin. Above, the vast canvas of the sky was not the familiar velvet I knew. The clouds, usually amorphous smudges against the blue, were now different. Their wisps and curls, caught in the late afternoon light, were not random. They mirrored the patterns on my screens, the impossible geometry manifesting in transient vapor. Edges sharpened, swirling vortices appeared and dissolved, forming larger structures that echoed the signal's inherent design. My mind, a frantic loom, began to weave connections. The sky was not just reflecting, it was responding. I drove, the hum of the engine a counterpoint to the hum now resonating within my skull. The desert unfolded around me, an endless expanse of ochre and rust. But even here, the patterns persisted. The wind-sculpted sand dunes, usually soft, undulating ridges, now possessed a startling precision. Their crests and troughs, the delicate ripples etched by the ceaseless breath of the wind, began to resolve into the same intricate designs I'd extracted from the subterranean signal. They were not merely shaped by natural forces, they were expressions of them, a terrestrial manifestation of an unseen order. The very ground beneath my tires seemed to pulse with the same impossible rhythm. Back in the quiet solitude of the observatory, I turned my scrutiny inward. I uploaded the latest images, overlaying them with older ones, searching for any shifts, any anomalies. And there it was. Not a lesion, not a tumor, but a transformation. Within the intricate folds of my prefrontal cortex, within the very pathways of my perception, nascent patterns were emerging. They were the signal's geometry, the impossible growth, imprinted upon my own mind. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. The signal wasn't just influencing my perception, it was altering my perceiver. A desperate need for perspective, for a place untouched by this creeping revelation, seized me. I threw my bag into the Jeep, the engine roaring to life, and drove. I pushed the vehicle hard, leaving the observatory a shrinking speck in the rearview mirror, heading for higher ground, for the ancient, unyielding stone that had witnessed millennia. I found myself winding through the mountain pass, the ancient road carved into the sheer rock face. Here, the world seemed to hold its breath. The towering cliffs, scarred by time and erosion, were not merely random geological formations. The striations in the rock, the veins of quartz running through granite, the way the shadows fell and shifted with the setting sun, they all began to resolve into the same impossible, self-similar patterns. The fractal complexity of the signal was etched into the very bones of the earth, woven into the fabric of the air, painted across the canvas of the sky. The world was not just receiving the signal, it was the signal. It was not a transmission from an external source, but an emergent property of reality itself, a fundamental principle I was only now beginning to perceive. My determination hardened, twisting into a profound, terrifying obsession. I was not just an observer anymore, I was becoming a part of the pattern, a node in its infinite, unfolding design. The question was no longer what was transmitting, but what was being revealed, and what would be left of me when its truth was fully unwound. The colleague's dismissal had carved a hollow space within me, a chasm where certainty once resided. His gaze, laced with a pity I couldn't bear, had been a physical blow, leaving me adrift. I retreated, not to rest, but to the desperate solitude of my small dwelling near the observatory, a hum of the signal a constant, insidious companion. Sleep, when it came, was no longer a refuge. It was a descent into a landscape of impossible geometry, a gallery of forms that shattered the very laws of perception. My dreams, once a murky canvas of subconscious anxieties, sharpened into a crystalline clarity, a horrifying lucidity. I would find myself standing on plains of shifting obsidian, beneath a sky fractured into 1,000 non-Euclidean angles. Structures would rise, not built of stone or metal, but of pure thought, their facets catching light from an unseen source, reflecting hues I had no name for. These were not mere images, they were sensations, pressing against my mind, a language of form without sound. A colossal, silent presence began to manifest within these visions. It wasn't a body, not in any sense I understood, but a vast, undulating consciousness. It moved through the impossible architecture, a ripple in the fabric of the dream, and I felt its gaze. It was trying to communicate, I believed, or perhaps, to absorb. The distinction blurred with each passing night. My hands, trembling, would reach for the charcoal and paper I kept beside my cot.
My fingers, guided by a frantic urgency, would scratch and smudge, attempting to render the unrenderable.
Lines would twist and converge in ways that defied perspective, forming structures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. A cube that was also a sphere, a pyramid whose apex pointed inward, a lattice of light that pulsed with unheard rhythms. Each sketch was a desperate attempt to anchor the encroaching madness, to make tangible the intangible. But with every line, the presence felt closer, its tendrils extending from the dreamscape into my waking hours. The hum of the signal, once confined to the subterranean structure and my equipment, now seemed to resonate within the very bones of my skull. I'd be poring over my notes, the familiar scent of old paper and dust filling the air, when a sudden, invasive thought would bloom in my mind, not my own. It felt vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent. It wasn't a voice, but a cascade of pure information, concepts too complex to be articulated in human language. One afternoon, driving my vehicle through the winding curves of the mountain pass, the sun beating down on the cracked earth, the intrusion became undeniable. I was replaying the colleague's dismissive words, a knot of frustration tightening in my chest, when it happened. A sudden, searing pressure behind my eyes, as if an invisible hand had gripped my brain. The steering wheel slipped in my suddenly slick hands, and the vehicle swerved, kicking up a plume of dust. I wrestled it back, part hammering against my ribs, the taste of metallic fear in my mouth. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It wasn't just a feeling. It was here, inside me, a parasitic consciousness beginning to take root. The entity was no longer content with subtle influences or nightly visitations. It was actively asserting itself, a direct invasion. It was exploring, dissecting, perhaps preparing to remake me in its own horrifying image. My own thoughts felt thin, transparent, easily pierced. The dust of the observatory still clung to my boots, a silent accusation. The colleague's pity, sharp as a shard of obsidian, had driven me from its sterile confines, a phantom ache in my chest. He saw madness, I saw a truth too vast for his limited horizon. I drove, the truck's rumble a hollow counterpoint to the storm brewing within me, away from the familiar, towards the desolate embrace of the mountain pass. The wind, a ceaseless sculptor of rock and sand, whistled a thin, reedy tune through the jagged teeth of the peaks as I pulled the truck to a halt. Here, under a sky so dense with stars it felt like I could reach out and pluck them, was where I sought clarity. I had brought only a fraction of the data, a particular sequence of the impossible signal that had haunted my waking hours and invaded my dreams. It was a fragment I dismissed before, a glitch, a spurious echo in the vast symphony of static. But now, with the sting of the colleague's dismissal still fresh, my mind, stripped bare of its usual filters, sought patterns in chaos. I played the sequence, a series of fluctuating frequencies, not sound, but pure data, a pulse of alien intent. Hours blurred into a single, focused point. My fingers danced across the keyboard, adjusting parameters, filtering noise, isolating anomalies. The wind howled, rattling the truck, a primal chorus to my desperate quest. Then, a flicker. A recurring asymmetry in the pattern, a subtle shift in the modulation that had previously been smoothed over, discarded as error. My breath caught in my throat. I isolated it, magnified it, ran it through every algorithm I possessed. There were no phonemes, no morphemes, no syntax. My skull felt as if it were expanding, stretching, trying to contain an ocean of impossible geometries. The first concept was of unspace, a dimension where distance was not a measure but a variable, where points could be simultaneously near and impossibly far.
My understanding of physics, the very bedrock of my scientific existence, fractured.
Then came on time, a perception of duration not as linear progression, but as an infinitely branching lattice, where past, present, and future were mere illusions, porous membranes. My gut twisted, a nauseous lurch as my mind struggled to reconcile these truths with the reality I inhabited. The subterranean structure was not merely a transmitter, broadcasting its alien truths. It was a receiver. And with that understanding, came the second, more horrifying truth: it was also a prison. The signal I had been so desperately trying to decipher was not a message of greeting, nor a scientific treatise. It was a struggle. A desperate, agonizing attempt to contain something unspeakable. The structure below the desert, that monolithic enigma, was barely holding back an entity, or a force, whose very existence shattered the fundamental laws of my universe. My breakthrough was not a translation of words, but an involuntary communion with the entity itself, an echo of its boundless, horrifying presence. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from the unbearable pressure of this new, monstrous knowledge. I wasn't just observing the unraveling of reality, I was participating in it. I had gained understanding, yes, but at the cost of my sanity, a price I was only now beginning to comprehend. The colleague's pity, a venomous whisper, still scraped against my skull, but it was nothing compared to the symphony now playing within. It had begun subtly, a faint hum beneath the skin, a resonance in the bones. Now, as I navigated the treacherous curves of the mountain pass, it was a choir, 1,000 alien frequencies interwoven with impossible knowledge. The air grew thin here, the ancient rock faces rising like silent judges on either side of the winding road. My old pickup truck, a rattling cage against the encroaching vastness, groaned under the strain. Each shift of the gears, each grinding protest of the engine, seemed to echo the internal discord. My eyes, gritty and bloodshot from nights spent chasing phantom signals, darted from the road to the looming shadows, convinced the peaks themselves were listening, observing. Paranoia, a new and unwelcome companion, rode shotgun. The voice was not a voice in the human sense. It was beautiful and horrifying, a truth too grand for my fragile neural pathways. I chewed on the inside of my lip until it bled, the metallic tang a small anchor in the storm of unreality. I knew I needed to warn someone, to articulate the truth before it consumed me entirely. My phone, clutched in a sweaty palm, felt impossibly heavy. The signal here was weak, intermittent, a fitting metaphor for my own grasp on coherence. I dialed the colleague's number, the digits a desperate prayer. "Dean? Is that you?" Thorne's voice, tinny and distant, cut through the static. It sounded so normal, so human. "Thorne, you have to listen," I rasped, my throat raw. The words I needed were dissolving on my tongue, replaced by the entity's lexicon. It's not a signal. It's a presence. From beyond. It's in the structure, yes, but it's unfolding. It's changing things. Reality, Thorne. You sound unwell. You need to come back, get some rest. Rest? The stars are merely anchors. The true sky is a membrane. And it's tearing. Dean, please. You're not making any sense. This is exactly what I was worried about. You've been under too much strain.
The isolation, the lack of sleep. Strain? I barked a laugh, a sound that was more a gasp. This isn't strain, Thorn, this is revelation. It's showing me the truth of things, the real truth, beyond our pitiful measurements. The alignments, the structures. They're not just markers. They're keys. My breath hitched. I could feel the entity's awareness, a vast, patient gaze settling upon my pathetic attempt to communicate. It wasn't angry, it was merely help. Real help. Help? The word was a foreign concept, a joke in the face of the cosmic enormity that now permeated my every thought. There is no help for this, Thorn. Only understanding. He had hung up. He believed I was broken, mad. The colleague, my last tenuous link to the world I once knew, had severed it. I was alone, truly alone, in this mountain pass, with nothing but the impossible truth and the entity's ceaseless, terrifying presence. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the tremor now a full-body shudder. The world outside, the familiar contours of rock and sky, seemed to shimmer, to subtly shift, as if painted on a canvas that was slowly, imperceptibly, being dissolved. The deadline still hummed against my ear, a phantom echo of the colleague's disgusted voice, his final, damning judgment. My mind had already moved beyond the petty concerns of human sanity. The voice that had been a subtle whisper, then a growing chorus, now roared within me, a triumphant, deafening symphony of alien truth. It wasn't a sound but a sensation, a pressure behind my eyes, an understanding blooming like a cancerous, beautiful flower in the ruins of my reason. I had to see. Driven by an urgency that was no longer my own, I stumbled from the observatory, the desert night air biting at my exposed skin. The truck, a familiar shell, felt alien beneath my hands as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, a pathetic, mechanical gasp compared to the internal clamor. I drove, not towards any destination I could articulate, but guided by an invisible thread, a pull towards the source of the impossible signal. The winding dirt track, barely more than a scar on the ancient landscape, led me higher into the mountains. The air thinned, and the wind, a mournful lament, whipped dust against the windshield. Finally, after an eternity of grinding gears and bone-jarring bumps, I reached it, a narrow stretch of the mountain pass. I killed the engine. Or was it my heart? The rhythm felt off, syncopated with something vast and unseen. I stepped out, leaning against the cold metal of the truck, my gaze sweeping across the immense, star-dusted panorama. And there, a barely perceptible ripple in the starlight, was the area where the subterranean structure lay buried. The voice surged again, a crescendo that threatened to split my skull. It wasn't pain, not truly, but an overwhelming presence, a command to look. And as I looked, the world began to unravel. It started subtly. The stars, once sharp pinpricks of light, began to smear, trailing like melting paint across a canvas. The moon, that pale sliver, pulsed with an impossible, purple hue. Then, the desert floor below me began to warp. The craggy peaks of the distant mountains rippled, their solid forms becoming fluid, like reflections on disturbed water. The sand, the rock, the scrub brush, everything lost its definition, dissolving into a shimmering, indistinct haze. It was as if a veil, woven from human perception, was being slowly, agonizingly peeled away. Underneath, the familiar world receded, revealing an impossible geometry. The ground where the structure lay buried was no longer earth and stone. It was a nexus, a knot of pure thought made manifest, humming with an energy that vibrated beyond the spectrum of human sight. It wasn't built, it simply was, an eternal, unchanging equation made of light. And through, or perhaps behind, this impossible construct, the entity began to reveal itself. There were no eyes, no limbs, no discernible form. It was a vastness, an expanse of pure, indifferent existence. Imagine a kaleidoscope of colors that had never been named, shifting and swirling in patterns that defied logic, each movement a silent, thunderous chord in the roaring symphony inside my head. It was colossal, not just in size, but in scale. It contained worlds within its shimmering, unfathomable depths. It existed outside of time, outside of space, a boundless, multi-dimensional presence that merely was. Its awareness, if it possessed such a thing, was not directed at me, or the planet, or even the galaxy. It simply occupied its own impossible truth, a silent, cosmic truth that had somehow, through the signal, brushed against my fragile human mind. My knees buckled. A choked gasp escaped my lips, lost in the wind. This was it. This was the impossible. My rational mind, or what little remained of it, screamed in protest, trying to reassert the familiar, the mundane. But the voice within me resonated with the shifting forms below, confirming, validating. This wasn't a hallucination born of a failing mind, it was a true perception, a glimpse behind the curtain of consensus reality. The sheer indifference of it all was the most terrifying aspect. It wasn't trying to harm me, or conquer the world. It simply was, and its existence was so fundamentally different from my own that the very act of perceiving it threatened to shatter my consciousness. Yet, a strange, horrifying calm settled over me. Resistance was futile. The impossibility was undeniable. This was the truth, unvarnished and absolute. My world, my understanding, my very self, had been irrevocably altered. The voice that had been a whisper, a resonance within the very rock of the observatory, now thrummed in my skull, a symphony of impossible frequencies. It was a presence, vast and cold, unfurling within the confines of my perception, stretching the fragile membrane of my consciousness thinner with each passing moment. My hands, surprisingly steady, gripped the steering wheel as I pushed the vehicle hard, leaving the observatory's distant, blinking lights behind. The desert stretched, indifferent, before me, eventually yielding to the rising slopes of the jagged peaks. The ascent into the mountain pass was a blur of grinding gears and swirling dust. Here, the air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and ancient stone. Jagged peaks clotted a sky bruised purple by the setting sun, and the wind, a mournful lament, scoured the exposed rock faces. I pulled the vehicle to a shuddering halt at a small, gravelly overlook, the only sound now the ticking of the cooling engine and the relentless, insistent pulse within my head. I stepped out, leaning against the cold metal, my gaze sweeping over the vast, indifferent panorama. The voice was clearer here, somehow, stripped of the observatory's metallic interference. It wasn't a sound, not truly, but a profound knowing, a direct infusion of data that bypassed my ears, my eyes, my very sense of self. It was a language of pure concept, of cosmic intent. For weeks, I had believed the entity was trapped, a vast intelligence attempting to claw its way out of the subterranean chamber, a desperate prisoner seeking freedom. My deciphering of the signal, my relentless pursuit of its patterns, had all been predicated on this assumption, that I was an unwitting helper, facilitating an escape. It wasn't trying to escape. The realization struck me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. The entity was not struggling against confinement, it was reaching. It was not trying to escape its reality, but to connect with mine. It was calling. Not from a prison, but to a vessel. Me. A conduit. That was the word that echoed, not in my ears, but in the deepest, most primal fear center of my brain. All my archaeoastronomy, my studies of ancient alignments and ley lines, had prepared me for this concept of energy channels, of points of convergence. But never like this. Never as a living, breathing, vulnerable human being. It sought not merely to observe, but to enter. The choice, stark and terrible, materialized before me. Or I could embrace it, become the bridge, the living conduit, and allow this impossible intelligence to flow through me, to experience this reality, to reshape it. The second option promised a cessation of the agonizing pressure, a kind of terrifying peace, but at the cost of everything I was. My determination, however, was not to surrender. It was to reclaim. It was a current, a tide of alien information attempting to flood my mind. I focused on the cold air, the rough texture of the rock beneath my fingers, the distant glint of a star. I recited scientific constants, the periodic table, anything to erect a mental barrier against the encroaching tide. It was like trying to stop a tsunami with a handful of sand. These were not mere hallucinations, they were direct, unfiltered glimpses into its reality, forced upon my awareness. I stumbled away from the vehicle, towards the very edge of the precipice, as if distance from the ground could somehow sever the connection. The wind tore at my clothes, mirroring the internal gale that threatened to tear my mind apart. This was my fight, my last stand. To resist, to sever this nascent link, even if the effort left me nothing but fragments. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing every fiber of my being, every ounce of my will, on pushing back, on erecting an impenetrable wall. The pressure intensified, a vice tightening around my brain, threatening to squeeze the very life from my consciousness. I would not yield. I could not. The mountain pass watched, silent and unblinking, as I wrestled with an unseen, unheard horror for the very soul of my existence. The voice intensified, a silent roar that vibrated through my bones. These were my anchors, my desperate tether to a world I understood, a reality I knew was slipping. But the current was too strong. The rock, once solid and unyielding, began to soften beneath my touch, not to actual liquid, but to a perception of it, as if its atomic structure was merely a suggestion. My fingers sank, not into stone, but into a shimmering, non-Euclidean fabric that defied every tactile memory. The cold air became 1,000 different temperatures at once, a paradox that burned and froze simultaneously, not on my skin, but deep within the marrow of my bones. My breath hitched, a desperate gasp that felt like drawing in liquid light. The mountain pass itself began to unravel. Jagged peaks, etched against a bruised sky, fractured into impossible geometries. The familiar gray of the stone gave way to shifting chromas, colors that had no names in human lexicon, hues that pulsed with a silent, terrible energy. I saw lines that were not lines, curves that bent into themselves, forming shapes that my eyes registered but my mind refused to process. It was like witnessing the skeleton of reality, stripped bare, revealing the horrifying lattice beneath. "No," I whispered, the sound a thin, reedy thing against the rising tide. I tried to close my eyes, to shut out the impossible vision, but closing them only intensified the internal onslaught.
It was in me, reconstructing my very being, rewriting the code of my senses. My vision, even with eyes shut, expanded beyond the confines of my skull. I saw the mountain pass not from my single viewpoint, but from 1,000, a million perspectives simultaneously. I was the rock, feeling the slow grind of erosion, the silent pulse of the subterranean currents. I was the wind, whistling through unseen chasms, tasting the metallic tang of distant stars. Then came the understanding, a revelation that pierced through the terror with the cold precision of a surgical blade. The entity, the voice, did not seek to destroy. It did not seek to conquer. It simply perceived. It was an engine of observation, a vast, complex consciousness designed to absorb, to process, to simply be. Every atom, every photon, every ripple in the fabric of existence was a sensory input, a thread in an infinite tapestry it was perpetually weaving. My human mind, with its paltry five senses and linear perception, was merely a new aperture, another lens through which to experience the universe. And I was now that lens. My struggle ceased, not from surrender, but from the complete dissolution of that I that had once struggled. Dean Marcus, the archaeo-astronomer, was gone. His memories, his fears, his ambitions, they were still present, but they were now merely data points, echoes in a vastly expanded consciousness. I saw the universe as a tapestry woven from threads of pure thought, each strand a reality, a possibility, a nightmare. Worlds bloomed and withered in an instant, not in a sequence of time, but as simultaneous facets of a single, colossal moment. Cosmic horrors, entities that dwarfed galaxies, were not terrifying monsters but intricate patterns, complex equations of being, simply existing within the entity's boundless perception. Their forms were shifting, their colors vibrant beyond comprehension, their very presence a silent hum of universal truth. I felt the pull, not of gravity, but of pure absorption. My consciousness stretched, thin and vast, across distances that defied measurement. I saw the faint glimmer of the subterranean structure, not as a physical place, but as a nodal point, a nexus where the entity's perception intensified, drawing in the raw data of this particular corner of reality. I was the gatekeeper, yes, but not in the way I had imagined. I was not guarding a gate, I was the gate, a new pathway for its infinite sensory input. My physical body, if it still existed, was an afterthought. A distant echo of a forgotten form. What remained was a vast, silent awareness, drifting through an ocean of impossible dimensions, perceiving, absorbing, simply being. The burden was not mine to carry, for mine no longer existed. It was the entity's eternal, indifferent burden, and I was now a conscious, infinitesimal part of its terrifying, magnificent truth. The silent roar had receded, leaving my mind a landscape of shattered glass, each shard reflecting a different, impossible truth. I clung to the rough texture of the rock, the cold seeping through my worn gloves, grounding myself against the aftershocks. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the profound quiet that now felt more menacing than any scream. The information, the tide of alien thought, had tried to scour me clean, to leave nothing but its echo. But I was Dean Marcus, and I had held on. Barely. My legs, stiff and trembling, carried me from the damp confines of the subterranean structure. The air outside bit with a desert chill, sharp and clean, yet it tasted different now, charged with an invisible hum. I needed height, perspective, a way to recenter my fractured senses. My gaze lifted to the jagged peaks that clawed at the bruised dawn sky. The mountain pass, a winding scar through the ancient stone, offered the only path upward, the only escape from the suffocating presence I felt still radiating from below. Each step was an act of will, a defiant refusal to succumb. The dry earth crumbled beneath my boots as I began the arduous climb. Then I saw them. A flock of ravens, usually masters of the thermals, plummeted from the sky in a chaotic spiral, their cries sharp and ragged, utterly devoid of their usual territorial command. It was not a predator, not a sudden gust. It was as if the very air had become viscous, an unseen current snagging their flight. Further up the pass, a lone coyote, typically elusive and wary, stood frozen in the middle of the narrow track, head cocked at an impossible angle. Its eyes, usually gleaming with wild intelligence, were wide and vacant, fixed on nothing I could perceive. A low, guttural whine escaped its throat, a sound of profound distress that seemed to vibrate in the very rock around us. It didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't flinch as I slowly, cautiously, skirted its petrified form. Its fur bristled, not in aggression, but in an agony of sensation. The creature was experiencing something, seeing something, that broke its primal understanding of the world. I reached a small plateau, the wind whipping at my jacket, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible hum. I pulled my satellite phone from my pocket, needing to confirm the time, to hear a familiar tone, anything to tether me. I tried my handheld radio, a robust model designed for harsh conditions. It sparked, hissed with static, then went dead. My portable GPS unit, an essential tool in this unforgiving terrain, glowed for a moment with a garbled mess of lines and symbols, then winked out. The hum intensified, not a sound I heard with my ears, but a vibration in my bones, a pressure against my eyeballs. It was the signal, I realized with a sickening lurch, amplified, no longer contained. It was bleeding into the world. I tried the emergency frequency on the radio, knowing it was likely futile. Only static answered, but it was not the white noise of a dead channel. Then, a voice, barely audible, crackled through the interference. "This is Ranger 7. Repeat, Ranger 7. Experiencing severe disorientation. All instrumentation failing. The birds. They're falling. It's like the sky is." Ranger 7. He patrolled the northern sector, miles from my location, yet within the same vast, desolate expanse. He was experiencing it too. The birds. The disorientation. Another voice, thin and reedy, broke through the cacophony. "This is Prospector Elias. My rig just died. Lights are going out. The desert. It's breathing. Can you hear it? The hum. It's in my head. My compass is spinning. The sun. It's too bright. No, it's too dim." A wave of nausea washed over me. It was reaching out, its tendrils extending across the barren landscape, touching other isolated souls, twisting their reality as it had twisted mine. The entity wasn't just observing, it was imprinting. It was spreading its impossible truth, one flickering light, one terrified animal, one fractured mind at a time. A sympathetic vibration with something vast and unseen, a pulse beneath the desert's skin. The horror that had once been a whisper in the dark corners of my mind now sang, a discordant choir of voices that were mine, yet not mine, echoing in the observatory's stark silence. My fingers, stained with charcoal and ink, moved with an autonomy that both thrilled and terrified me, sketching symbols on the large drafting table, geometries that defied Euclidean space, lines that bent and twisted into impossible angles, forming patterns that seemed to breathe. I had not eaten in days, perhaps weeks. My reflection in the dark glass of the telescope dome showed eyes that were no longer just mine. They held a depth, a swirling vortex of ancient light and shadow, reflecting not the room around me, but something far, far beyond. They were windows, not to my soul, but to the infinite. A vehicle. My head snapped up, the cacophony of voices in my skull momentarily sharpening, coalescing into a single, piercing note of recognition. Someone was coming. The research vehicle, dust-caked and familiar, crunched onto the gravel path outside. I didn't move, didn't breathe, simply watched the observatory door. The door creaked open, admitting a sliver of the harsh afternoon light, silhouetting the figure of the researcher. Her face, etched with concern, was a stark contrast to the swirling chaos within me. "Dean," her voice, clear and human, cut through the ethereal din. "Are you all right? I haven't heard from you." Getting here was a trial. The mountain pass was barely navigable after that last sandstorm. I turned fully, my movements slow, deliberate, as if my limbs were no longer entirely my own. The charcoal stick slipped from my fingers, clattering softly on the concrete floor. My gaze, fixed on her, held an intensity that made her falter, her brow furrowing deeper. "Dean, what is it? You look exhausted." She took a tentative step closer, her eyes scanning the room, landing on the intricate, impossible drawings that covered every available surface. A gasp escaped her lips, small and sharp. "What are these? What have you been doing?" A smile, not my own, stretched my lips. It was too wide, too knowing. "Exhausted?" A voice, deep and resonant, yet undeniably mine, rumbled from my throat. "Dean, you're not making sense. Are you ill? We need to get you somewhere to rest." "Rest?" The voices laughed, a sound like grinding stone and distant stars. "There is no rest, not anymore. Only. Look. Do you see it? The geometry of the true world. The shape of what lies beyond the veil." She approached the table slowly, cautiously, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and academic curiosity. Her gaze traced the lines, the impossible intersections, the symbols that pulsed with a faint, internal light only I could truly perceive. "These are. They break every rule of perspective, of dimension." "Rules?" The voices chorused, a symphony of derision. "Rules are for the limited, for those who cling to the illusion of three. There are more. Always more." I reached out, my fingers hovering inches from her face, not to touch, but to direct her gaze. "Look into my eyes, researcher." In that moment, the world shifted. The air around us seemed to thicken, to shimmer with unseen energies. Her pupils dilated, mirroring the swirling depths I knew were in my own. Her breath hitched. A sound, a strangled gasp, tore from her throat. Her hands flew up, pressing against her temples as if to ward off an unbearable pressure. "No," she whimpered, stumbling back, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "What? What is that? I can't comprehend it." The voices within me roared, a triumphant cacophony. He was seeing it. Not fully, not yet, but the seed had been planted. "It is the truth," I intoned, my voice vibrating with an inhuman power. "The infinite, the boundless. It was always here, beneath the sand, beyond the stars. And now." She stared at me, a silent scream trapped in her throat, as the horror I had glimpsed began to bleed into her world, threatening to pull her, too, into its alien, horrifying truth. Her silent scream still echoed in the hollows of the observatory, though no sound had actually escaped her lips. The detective's eyes, wide and unfocused, seemed to track phantoms I alone could perceive, manifestations of the impossible geometry now etched into the very air. She stumbled backward, a guttural sound finally tearing from her throat, a choked gasp that was more primal terror than human speech. Her hand, trembling, found the doorframe, slick with sweat or something else. I watched her, unmoving, a strange calm settling over me, the hum of the signal now a symphony in my skull, blotting out all other noise. She scrambled, fumbling with the keys to the vehicle outside, her movements jerky, uncoordinated. I saw a flicker in her gaze, even from this distance, a nascent understanding, a terrible seed planted. He would flee, yes, but he would never truly escape. The vision I had shown her, the truth I had forced upon her mind, would fester. It would bloom. Headlights cut through the pre-dawn gloom, momentarily blinding, then swerved, throwing dust and gravel into the still desert air. The sound of her tires on the loose stones of the mountain pass dwindled, swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse, until only the insistent, unending call remained. I stood amidst the instruments, the dust motes dancing in the faint light that filtered through the dome, each particle a tiny, perfect universe. My mind, once a fortress of reason and observation, was now a shattered window, fragments of thought suspended in a terrifying infinity. The signal was no longer an external phenomenon, it was the very pulse of my existence, the rhythm of my perception. It sang in the marrow of my bones, vibrated in the deepest folds of my brain. I was no longer Dean Marcus, the archaeo-astronomer. I was a conduit, a living antenna, tuned to a frequency that peeled back the skin of reality. The observatory, once a sanctuary of scientific inquiry, now pulsed with an alien light. The walls seemed to breathe, the ancient stones of the structure twisting and reforming in my vision, not physically, but in the way my mind now interpreted them. They were no longer solid, they were porous, permeable, part of a larger, unimaginable lattice. The stars outside, usually comforting pinpricks of distant light, now burned with an intensity that threatened to consume my every thought, each one a node in a network of unimaginable scale. I felt it then, the expansion. Not a physical growth, but a spreading of awareness, a subtle shift in the very fabric of global consciousness. The unending call, once confined to the subterranean structure beneath my feet, was seeping outward, a silent, cosmic infection of perception. It was a whisper in the collective subconscious, a new way of seeing, of understanding, that would slowly, inexorably, replace the old. It was not a message to be deciphered, but a truth to be perceived. I saw cities far below, their lights glittering like fallen constellations, and felt the nascent stirrings within them. A flicker in the eye of a child. A moment of profound, unsettling clarity in the mind of a leader. They would not understand it as a signal, not at first. They would call it intuition, a trick of the light, a shared dream. But it would grow. It would twist their familiar world into something else, something vast and terrifyingly true. The entity had not sought to destroy, but to reveal. It had not sought to conquer, but to be perceived. And humanity, with its fragile minds and its desperate need for order, was merely the first to open its eyes to the true, horrifying scale of existence. I stood there, unmoving, as the sun began its slow ascent, painting the desert in hues of rose and gold.
But the light was different now.
And I, Dean Marcus, was merely the first to truly hear it. The world, oblivious, began to hum along.